God is dead, but not everyone seems to have heard the news. Now, if you find yourself already becoming somewhat uncomfortable and maybe even defensive with the idea, this is not an uncommon reaction to it. Nietzsche tells us that God is dead, and this is one of the most interesting proclamations that he makes, I think, because it's not at all clear what it is that it means. And if you ask your average person on the street, they may have something negative to say about Nietzsche with respect to this proclamation. They may have something negative to say about him being a heretic or a blasphemer, perhaps, and saying that God is dead. But what does that mean? Does it even make any sense? I mean, if we look at it in the Christian context, we typically think about God as eternal. And eternal beings not only can't die, but the idea of death doesn't make any sense. They are beyond time, as it were. So, death is something that belongs to those things which are temporal. If you think about God as eternal, then this statement doesn't even make any sense. But nevertheless, this offends a great deal of people simply because it sounds offensive, I think. And it really requires a deeper dive into to what it is that Nietzsche was trying to do here, what it is that he was trying to say, really almost from a historical point of view, to get this to make any sense at all. Now, I like to take, in the vein of Socrates, sort of a survey of the class and find out what it is that people think about this statement and what it might possibly mean. Because it's only very occasionally that I get someone that hits on something that is near at least what the commentators agree that this phrase actually means. In other words, this is not a very well understood bit of Nietzsche at all. Nevertheless, it is a very popular phrase from Nietzsche, and that puts us in a very interesting situation. You have something that is popularly objected to, but people don't even know what it is. All right. So if you're following along in your PowerPoint, you've probably already skipped ahead to the answer. The idea behind the phrase God is dead, I think defensively, is that Nietzsche is saying that we've killed the viability, the possibility of having a living notion of divinity. In other words, our notion of a God as it existed 1,000 years ago can no longer viably exist today. Culture has changed too much, and we have had an irreversible change in our Weltanschauung, you might say, such that there's no longer any room left in there for mystery and divinity as there once was. Now, this is, I think, perhaps a less controversial claim than the idea that maybe someone killed God. Because Nietzsche says that we killed God, but from the historical perspective, it's the case that we no longer allow for the possibility of the idea of divinity to be as sustainable and viable as it once was, and this is a very sensible claim. But nevertheless, it has at least the superficial sound of great heresy. So I think what we're really talking about here is an historical commentary on the changes in perspective in society. And Nietzsche is the byproduct of this. You might say even an early byproduct of this. The church changed significantly and had been changing significantly with respect to the learning of the age, you might say, the science and philosophy that was being done. From the time of at least 1100 on, when the sciences proper started to develop in a bit more of their modern and full form. So unfortunately, you might say that this is one of the first times in the Christian era, that is since the time of Christ, that you did see very much scientific advancement. So this was something of a new thing. Well, this new thing caused a change in the culture. And what Nietzsche is going to argue is that when the culture changes, and when people start to see things differently, and their essentially Weltanschauung of the world, their perspective of the world changes, certain ideas and beliefs, theological systems, and what he would certainly call superstitions can no longer be seen as viable. Now, this probably, if we look at it outside of our own culture, then this is a very reasonable claim. In fact, you might even say this is an eminently reasonable claim. When we look at the history of religion, as we did in our 9th lecture, then we saw that religion traced changes according to how it was that men related to the world. the nature of technology and even mathematics, so that changes in astronomy, changes in staple foods, and the move from a hunter-gatherer to an agricultural society necessitated changes in the mythology. And so it's not surprising then that if we should change our relation to the world and the way that we see the world, especially in terms of physics and chemistry, no longer having the earth at the center of the universe, let's say, and maybe even no longer having man as anything special, but simply one of the mechanisms in a very large and complicated clock, so to speak, as that was the perhaps not an entirely unrepresentative characterization of the metaphor for physics of the age, then it seems quite natural that the religion, if it's going to continue to serve the purpose that it did before in relating man to the universe, it must do so differently. And Nietzsche is simply saying that the idea of God has been pushed out and that we no longer have room for that in our current perspective. So this is a subtle claim, and it requires some knowledge of history, both religious history and scientific history, to know what it is that's changed and what it is that he could be saying. Essentially what he's saying is that, to put it another way with respect to belief, is that the belief that people had, the faith that people had 1,000 years ago, is no longer possible. So it stands to reason then that we might need to create something to put in its place. And Nietzsche is simply arguing that whatever it is that we create, it has to be done without the nature of, or without the tool of the divine, without the tool of a Godhead. So this is really what he's suggesting, I think, and throughout this book, Zarathustra, we see this kind of theme, where Zarathustra is in the process of first sweeping away all of the old and making way for the new, and the new must be something where, with the Overman, Nietzsche says this is someone who knows how to live in a godless world. Well, this is what's meant by this. When the gods are no longer viable and man can no longer sustain a belief in them because of irreversible changes in perspective, then the new values and the new place for religion must be one that doesn't include the Godhead. And this is all that he's claiming here, I think. So seen in this kind of light, although I don't know if it's any less heretical, it may be at least a little bit more intelligible. All right. Now, people frequently argue that when you don't have a God in the picture, or when you don't have religion in the picture, that there's not going to be any morality. There's not going to be any hold on behavior, and people are just going to go wild. And in practice, I don't think this is really the case. And even among the godless in our culture, you might say, those that don't profess a belief in any particular religion, that percentage is significantly larger than those who are in prison. Something like 15-3. I don't know the exact numbers. And because of this, I think we might justifiably deduce that people are driven to control their behavior by other things, instead of just using morality as inherited from religion. Now, Nietzsche says that if you don't have a God in the picture, if you don't have a religion giving you your ethical standards, then you're not going to have an objective standard for morality or the meaning of your life or any kind of purpose in it. And this is perhaps not an unreasonable claim. But remember, though, that Nietzsche argued against objectivity generally. So this is a very natural conclusion, I think, for him in light of that previous argument. Now, Nietzsche mentions doing philosophy with a hammer, and this is one of the amusing metaphors for his way of doing things, where in the process of releasing oneself from the burdens given to you by society, and those burdens are its values that have been internalized or at least attempted to have been acculturated, Nietzsche sees himself as going through and tapping the various idols with a hammer and destroying them. So getting rid of the old system of values and making way then for the new. So this is something of a Socratic approach in intimating that we must first clear the way if we are going to do anything creative and anything individualized and new. In this way, Nietzsche saw himself as an immoralist. And this is perhaps an amusing appellation, if nothing else, but it points to a significant departure from the way that the people had previously thought. Now, Nietzsche says elsewhere, outside of Zarathustra, that has it ever occurred to people that perhaps the entire notion of ethics, the entire notion that there should be a system of ethics in right and wrong, is wrong-headed? And this is ultimately, I think, what he's referring to by the label immoralist, such that this is someone who lives outside of the idea of morality, or perhaps beyond the idea of morality, someone who has gotten beyond the need for the idea of a morality. Now, all of these concepts and all of these arguments culminate in essentially the concept of the overman. And the overman is basically Nietzsche's sage, the person who exemplifies his philosophical development and understanding. And so someone who knows how to live in a godless universe, someone who creates his own table of values, who is beyond the sickness of modernity, and who has gone beyond the notion of right and wrong. And this is a difficult concept, I think, for the very reason that Nietzsche sees this as kind of an end state. And whenever you have this, and remember this is true for the other philosophies that we've covered as well, when you're talking about perhaps the eudaimonia of Aristotle, the notion of world reason for the Stoics, the Tao of Taoism, Nirvana in Buddhism, all of these end states tend to be very difficult to understand because there seems to be an implicit argument, or in many cases explicit, that it is entirely beyond words. It's something that you have to experience, and it's not something that you're going to understand purely by reason alone. And therefore, it's not something that we can simply define. And so Nietzsche's notion of the overman then isn't something that you can look at like, changing your socks and contemplate and know perfectly what it is that you're getting into. The nature of religious revelation and philosophical epiphanies, you might say, are of the same sort, is such that before you have them, you can't understand what they're like, and after you have them, you can't get rid of them. So you can't experience something artificially, and once you've had the experience, you can't unexperience it. It's a part of your life from that point on, and the overman is very much this kind of argument. So the overman is essentially one who sees aright, according to Nietzsche, with respect to the world perspective that dominates his age, and sees what to do with it. So he understands that God is dead. He understands that he must, tap all of the old idols with a hammer, destroying the systems past because they no longer work for his current place in the world. They no longer work for his current society. I think perhaps this is a useful point to backtrack a little bit and elucidate this point. Nietzsche is essentially arguing that at any given time, religion and philosophy, under the same umbrella, serve the same sort of function in finding a way to relate man to the world and provide for him perhaps a sense of purpose, or at least think about what it means for him to live and how it is that he should live. And so give him some kind of prescription, and give him, if you will, some kind of habit, perhaps, at least in terms of a way of thinking, that he may relate to the world in a sensible way, in a way that is knowable and understandable to him, and this is very important. So it cannot be entirely a mystery to him. He must not be completely lost in the chaos. And so if he's not going to be lost in the chaos, then he has to have either beliefs, or, you might argue, pejoratively with respect to philosophy, beliefs in the knowledge that philosophy and science offers, and say that, yes, this is the way that the world works. Either, yes, Zeus and Poseidon and all of the others are involved mechanistically in the world and with respect to my relation to it psychologically, or perhaps that physics and chemistry hold true, and this tells us something about the way that the world works and my place in it of apparent relative insignificance. Now, you might notice a lacuna there with respect to psychology, and this is something that hasn't gone unnoticed. As I believe I've already mentioned once this semester, there was an Eastern thinker encountering this particular aspect of the West, said that we do a lot for knowledge in our schools, but we do very little for the mind in terms of its health. So we're not too concerned with one's psychological health. And so that is kind of an interesting notion, that we try to divorce our educational system from psychological health, and thinking that this should be treated properly, perhaps under the auspices of religion, which the educational system tries to at least separate itself from, if it's possible. Although you might argue that if one's perspective on the world is informed by education and religion, then they're competing for the same ground in some respects, and so that divorcing is ultimately impossible, at least at a certain level. This, I think, is something that Nietzsche would argue, in that if we try to separate those two, all you can ever hope for is an artificiality and probably a starving of the intellect for what it most needs, namely how to be healthy, how to live. And so someone who is raised purely on science and reason and knowledge alone is going to be left probably without these kind of prescriptions. And Nietzsche saw this kind of thing and said, okay, we have to do something about this. We have a gap. Science has basically washed away for us the plausibility of God and the plausibility of belief in religion as we once knew it, but it has only replaced part of that perspective, and so we still need to replace the rest of that perspective. And so man needs valuation. As he says in Zarathustra, without valuation, the nut of existence is hollow. And so that emptiness that a lot of people report in their lives as a result of not knowing where to go, not knowing one's purpose, not knowing one's meaning or place in the universe, is probably representative of just this sort of gap and just this sort of issue with respect to our modern society. Now, Campbell, Joseph Campbell, whom we'll talk about more in the comparative religion lecture, speaks to this directly in saying that one of the things that happened here is that our society just changed too fast. And the process of religious change is one that must happen slowly. And it must also be allowed to happen. So there are two different facets of this. Our society and our culture, the way that we relate to the world and see the universe, changed too quickly for religion to be able to accommodate it. And we see hints of this in the stories that we tell, in the new myths that we create. And we'll talk about that more when we get to that section of the course. So we're trying to do this, but the historicity of the religions that we have inherited makes this somewhat difficult, where there is always the proclamation of, so it is written, and you can't change it. And when a religion becomes written, then it is no longer allowed to change in the way that it once was. Although I think it is interesting, if you do a survey of the way that the Catholic Church has changed with respect to its relation to and interpretation of the canonical texts, you'll find that there's probably a good deal more mutability there than we've seen in Protestantism, which is a curious phenomenon. But nevertheless, that's an argument for another day. Suffice to say that Nietzsche sees, as many people have, a gap in our perspective, in that we no longer have a complete way of relating to the world. And so we relate to it in terms of science and technology, and that science and technology has made it difficult, if not impossible, as Nietzsche claims, for us to believe in the old religions. But it has not supplied a complete metaphysics. It has not supplied any sort of direction for living. Not that those two have to be the same thing, because remember, Buddhism can be seen as supplying something that is complete, but without a metaphysics. But it at least addresses the point. Science avoids it altogether, I think, in saying that, well, this just isn't something that we can study right now, so let's not address it, unless we can do so with certainty. Now, Jung actually addresses this concept in the archetypes volume that you have, with the discussion of, or I should say the article of the phenomenology of the spirit and fairy tales, in saying that as far as a scientific examination of psychology, we really are unable to do this sort of thing, because as he recognizes, the psyche can only be studied from the psyche's perspective, and so we are ultimately limited to a subjective assessment, or at least reporting, of these events. And we have no, as he called it, Archimedean perspective, an outside standing of objectivity that we can look from, vantage point that we can look from and study these things. And so one might include psychology as well in this problem, though I don't think this is typically the way that it's addressed in an academic format. So there's an interesting problem for the modern university system in this way. And this is something that's been evolving over a long period of time, and trying to borrow the authority of the sciences and place it into areas where, as Aristotle might have said, we should only give precision as much as we can. And insofar as it is not possible to give that kind of scientific precision, we shouldn't even have the pretenses of doing so. And I think psychology is one of those cases where, in large part, as Jung recognizes with the archetypes, it's just not something that you can study. directly like that. It's not something that you can measure, because it is something that it only ever presents itself in the local clothes. And so if you're making any kind of abstraction into the general, then you're already intellectualizing the problem. And any way of getting at the archetypes is going to require that kind of thing, and ultimately involve yourself in a sort of non-scientific reasoning, if you will. So that's a potential problem for these areas of study. So ironically, one might argue that it's our desire for certainty in the sciences that has prevented us from addressing any of these metaphysical questions. And because of this, the perspective that is given to us now by our culture tends to lack this sort of thing. And this is an issue for the person, and this is something that must be filled somehow. And the question is, how do you do it? What kind of mythology is appropriate for us at the present age? And with a backing from a culture that is based upon essentially a scientific perspective, whether we like it or not, as Nietzsche has pointed out. Now, Nietzsche prescribes a solution for this, and his solution is the Overman. So perhaps this is a more complete answer to what is the Overman, and what is Nietzsche trying to do in Zarathustra. And this is really the answer. Zarathustra is trying to propose a course of action for people, what it is that you do, that, in other words, filling in the gaps for our perspective that we don't get from the university system, that we don't get from science and technology. And he suggests specifically doing philosophy with a hammer, sweeping away all of the things that you know to have been aged and no longer viable, specifically the notions of God that we've inherited, and start over and create your own values, and values that are peculiar to the individual. Now, this is an interesting claim. Do we have to have values that are peculiar to the individual? Is this the kind of society that we have, or is this the kind of acculturation that is the kind of future wave for us? Is this the direction that our culture is headed, such that the only viable perspective is one that is interpreted on an entirely individual level? And that's really a good question. Campbell seems to agree with this in his Creative Mythology, the final volume in his Mass of God series. So we have other scholars that approach this sort of thinking and say, okay, what do we do in the modern age? Well, it appears to be something that is individualistic. So that's at least in keeping with our culture's individualist bent. There are a few more ideas of Nietzsche's that I want to cover before we go into Zarathustra in particular. First, the idea of amor fati, in other words, love of fate. This is what Nietzsche identified with the sacred yes to life. In other words, being life-affirming, embracing one's fate, and not so much fighting it. And this is akin, I think, to the Stoics' idea, to want things to be as they are, instead of trying to change things that you know you can't change. Now, included also in this discussion is, and the positive aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy are not as often discussed, so these may seem to be sort of disjoint with a lot of the other invective that Nietzsche hurls at the various religious systems and whatnot. But nevertheless, the other idea that is curious and that people are not as familiar with is that Nietzsche regards life as an aesthetic practice, and he seems to hold a special place for beauty in general. And exactly what the role of beauty is in Nietzsche's philosophy is not perfectly clear, but he gives hints of, gods that can dance, for instance, and the idea that beauty somehow provides meaning that is in and of itself valuable. And this is really a continuity between a lot of the philosophical systems and thinkers that we've studied, in that people tend to look at beauty kind of in awe, not really knowing what to make of it. We seem to do things just in the pursuit of beauty, or at least where beauty is a major component of what it is that we're doing. And I'm not just talking about physical beauty of people. I'm talking about, of course, beauty of philosophical ideas and systems and things, and maybe even the beauty in mathematics, as we'll discuss in a few lectures. So that it looks as though one of our principal motivations for doing things is tied to basically aesthetic tendency. And what do you make of this? How do you do this? How do you make sense of it in a philosophical system? And since this is an individualized thing, it makes sense that Nietzsche would incorporate it and have some respect for it in his consideration in his development, such that this notion of beauty as pertains to the individual, since of course it varies somewhat from one individual to the next, should be part of and should be understood to be an important component of one's table of values that ultimately you create in phase 3. And we'll talk about that in a moment with the metamorphoses. Now, eternal recurrence is another idea which is especially curious, and I've heard a lot of people talk about this sort of thing. It's basically the idea of immortality. And if someone proposed to you that you were going to live forever, would you think that this was actually a good thing? And Nietzsche has a paper on eternal recurrence where he addresses this in particular and says, I think if most people thought about it, they would probably realize that it wasn't a good thing. And perhaps in the tradition of Schopenhauer, where he says that once you have viewed and seen life's tricks more than once, then they lose their charm, that life's tricks are not meant to be seen more than once, so that once you've been through it a couple of times, it ceases to be impressive. And if this is the case with the world in general, then one would have to think that ultimately despondence would prevail over a long period of time, having thereby been unimpressed with all of life's tricks. So this is one of the arguments that he provides. Now, Nietzsche does seem to imply something of a great circularity with respect to the recurrence of things. And this is an old mythic idea. Now, whether this constitutes a metaphysics for Nietzsche or whether it's just something that he tosses about as a, you might say, beautiful and useful concept potentially, it's really hard to say. But nevertheless, this is something that he speaks of, even if only briefly at times. Now, I should say a few words on Nietzsche about his relation to the Nazis. This is something that is popularly known, and this is a great area of misconception, I think, with respect to the philosopher. So it bears, especially in an introductory class, at least a few minutes of time. Now, you can see some of the quotes in the PowerPoint that are appropriate for this. It says, Nietzsche was furious when some of his ideas caused the rising anti-Semitic press to take him for a supporter. And indeed, Nietzsche was used as something of a source book for Hitler and the Nazis. But this source book was a result of his sister's work, not Nietzsche's work himself. And he even states plainly in one of his major works, as you can see there, Beyond Good and Evil, he says that rather than to expel the Jews, it might be useful and fair to expel the anti-Semitic screamers from the country. So he has more problem with the anti-Semites than he does with the Jewish population themselves. And this was made plain, especially with relation to his sister Elizabeth, of whom he says that there will be no reconciliation between that anti-Semitic goose and myself. So Nietzsche very squarely planted himself in opposition to the anti-Semites, but this was suppressed by his sister because she was among that population and wished to use her brother's fame and clout to her own ends. And Thomas Mann writes of this. Thomas Mann is a famous writer in the 20th century. He wrote The Magic Mountain, among others. In 1947, he says that the Nazis' use of Nietzsche was the clumsiest of all misunderstandings. So it's ironic, really, and one of the things that I like to say with this is that one almost has to suppose that for the Nazis to keep using Nietzsche, they would have to purposely not read him, because you don't have to read very much in Nietzsche before you find things that are incompatible with the anti-Semitic sentiment at the time. All right, let's go on to talk about Zarathustra in particular. There's a few things that need to be said with respect to the way that Zarathustra is set up. First of all, Zarathustra is depicted as someone who is 30 years of age. Now, this is the sort of normal age for a prophet. We get the same thing with Jesus, with the Buddha, and others, such that apparently, for whatever reason, 30 is a good time to begin to really have a coalescing of understanding about the world. And people tend to start preaching their unique doctrine at this point. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Nietzsche is at least playing on a long tradition there. Now, the three metamorphoses, that's an idea that I mentioned earlier, and this is a crucial idea for understanding the transformation in Zarathustra. And Nietzsche speaks of the camel, the lion, and the child. And the camel is what one begins as. So as a child, one begins as a camel, ironically, and takes on values of one's culture, and just takes on the values without questioning them, internalizing those values, and succumbing to the process of acculturation so that the values of the culture just seem right to you. And this is without any kind of rational speculation or any sort of gate that one has to pass through in terms of, is this reasonable or is it not? One simply takes on those values, whatever they are. And then the lion, he says in the second phase, must say no, the holy no, as he calls it, to destroy those values and slay the dragon, thou shalt. And he depicts thou shalt as a dragon with golden scales. Upon every scale there is a thou shalt proclamation. In other words, an inherited prescription of behavior from one's society. And so one has to destroy this dragon and all conceptions of how it is that you should behave so that you can really clear the way for creating your own table of values. And ultimately, this is accomplished by the child. And the fact that this is accomplished via metamorphoses is really significant. And this is not unfamiliar to religious transformation in general. And the idea is that one proceeds through a definite number of phases in assimilating information, processing it, and then ultimately having to reject that which doesn't work for you, and then clearing the way so that you can live in a healthy state psychologically and say yes, as Nietzsche says, the life-affirming holy yes, to those tables of values that you have created and that work for you in light of the present Weltanschauung and the present age and culture and its values and perspective on the world. And ultimately, as he argues, the only way of living in a healthy state is to accept, in other words, to understand those values which you can believe in, and then fill in the rest of the material around it with your own values. Now, this is not a random process, and this is something that is, one has to determine what works for you and what doesn't. And this is why the God is dead proclamation is so significant for Nietzsche's philosophy, because he says that in the modern age in Western society, God is dead, and you're not going to ultimately be able to viably choose God as an option. And so even though we are strongly inclined to do so, because during the camel phase, we internalized a lot of these things, and it just seems right to us, we also internalize the perspective that we have gotten from science and technology and the way that we relate to the world. But he says ultimately, the way that we relate to the world is incompatible with the way that the religion that we have inherited from our fathers, the preachers of death, as he calls them, related to the world. And therefore that must be cast aside, and something must be put in its place which rings consonant with the perspective that we can't dispense with.